This morning I called Dr. Edward Brooks Marmon, who is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. His new book, Pan-Africanism Versus Partnership, African Decolonization in Southern Rhodesian Politics, was published by Springer, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Enjoy the show. Dr. Brooks, thank you so much for making the time. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
That is wonderful. I was looking forward to this. And thank you very much for sharing your book. I was able to read it. I was able to go through it, and it's a very interesting read. We are doing a series on African nationalism, and we have gotten in a group of authors. We have had some public lectures that are on the series, and this would be a very interesting contribution to it. So before we get to maybe talk about the book particularly, I just want to know your history into this. How did you develop interests in studying African history in general and the history of Southern Rhodesia in particular?
Sure. Well, this has been a long time coming. So I did my bachelor's and master's, wrapped that up about 15 years ago, and worked for a number of years before returning to my PhD. And as an undergraduate, I studied abroad in Namibia, and I visited Zimbabwe at the end of the program. And that was very formative for me. Loved the experience. After graduating, I continued to work on African issues, mostly in West Africa. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger. I worked with some NGOs in Liberia for a few years, but I wanted to get back into research, and I wanted to have a reason to focus on Southern Africa again. And so I applied for PhD programs. I knew I wanted to do Zimbabwe. That was part of my proposal. Didn't yet quite have the idea that resulted in this book, but that emerged fairly quickly. And here I am today.
That's great. That's wonderful. So now, what are the core ideas of the book? If you can start maybe with what motivated you to write the book, and what are the core ideas of the book? And in the end, if you can include what you consider to be the central argument.
Yeah. So I've always been historically interested in transnational, international networks and connections. I think my original PhD proposal was to look at refugee flows into Rhodesia, white refugees. So this would have been, I think, especially around the independence of what's now the DRC in 1960, the collapse of Portuguese rule in Angola and Mozambique in the 1970s. And for a variety of reasons, I got into that project. It didn't really seem to be working out. I think it was a bit too niche, too targeted. I had not worked on Zimbabwe for my master's, so this was something that was totally new. I had done West African history for my master's, and I sort of just took stock of the literature. And there's this very common claim about African decolonization, independence of certain countries having this major influence on Rhodesia, colonial Zimbabwe. And so I'm specifically thinking of, there's often these sort of almost throwaway sentences about 1957, Ghana becomes independent, Kwame Nkrumah makes speeches about the total liberation of Africa, and someone will say, oh, and this also had an impact in Rhodesia. But it's not really been explored in detail. How did that impact come about? What were some of the more specific connections between Ghana and colonial Zimbabwe? And so that's really what the book tries to do, but not just with Ghana, but African decolonization writ large.
That's wonderful. That's great. So now, that's a very important point. And what countries did you choose to particularly focus on as you look at this topic? I understand you are obviously aware of these frontline states and their contribution to the liberation of Zimbabwe. What angle are you coming in with, and what informed the choices of the countries that you decided to analyze and to identify and isolate for this particular analysis?
So you had asked me about my argument, and I sort of neglected to address that. So I am looking at a period before the emergence of the frontline states. So a lot of the historical literature really picks up with the unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965, even in the 70s when the guerrilla war really heats up. And so I'm looking at an earlier period, which the book the subtitle has it going from 1950 to 63, but it's really, I would say, 3/4 or so of the sort of empirical, the data covers the period from 58 to 63. And so and it really tackles sort of two parallel but more or less interrelated points. And one, what is the impact of African decolonization on the white settler group that then controlled the country? And I find that there was very much a white backlash against decolonization. There was a election in 1962, a change in political power. And so a lot of what I try to track with the whites in Rhodesia is what happened elsewhere in Africa that contributed in that major change. And the other parallel track is sort of inverse reaction amongst the Black majority in Rhodesia, looking at other African countries becoming independent. And this initially, I argue, was a very positive stimulus for Black political activity in colonial Zimbabwe. But quite quickly, I think it became a double-edged sword. There's this excessive emphasis on Pan-Africanism, this competition perhaps to try to attain power when it seems like there may be a change in Rhodesia. And this leads to a number of splits in what was briefly a very unified and cohesive anti-colonial nationalist movement. So the two arguments are one, white backlash culminating in sort of white settler unity, and then two, African decolonization initially stimulating anti-colonial nationalist activity, but then being detrimental in causing friction. And so I look at this in two parts. The first part traces those splits, that election, in a purely sort of domestic framework. So I look at one issue that appears for both racial groups is 1961 Constitution.
Oh, yes.
Constitutional referendum. But a lot of the language around it was actually talking about events elsewhere in Africa. And so there are a number of developments like that. And then the second part of the book looks more in depth at the decolonization and independence of specific African countries and how that played out within colonial Zimbabwe. And so the main countries examined are Nigeria, Ghana, what was then the Congo, and now the DRC, and Malawi.
Wonderful. That's very interesting. So now, these countries, if we were to look at it, they, geographically speaking, they are further away from Southern Rhodesia. And, with that kind of geopolitics in mind, you do actually want to assume that countries closer to Rhodesia are probably the ones that would have had an impact on the decolonization of Southern Rhodesia. So now, just give me an example of maybe one country, and one country that you amongst these countries that you listed, and take me through the process of how much its independence contributed to the decolonization of Southern Rhodesia.
So I think the country that perhaps I am most excited about what I found in the research process going into the archives is Nigeria. So Malawi, DRC, they both have their own standalone chapters, and then there's one chapter that lumps in Ghana and Nigeria together. I think there's a bit that's talked about with Nigeria's role around the Lancaster House Conference and sort of the final period leading up to Zimbabwe's independence in the late 1970s. But this much earlier period, really the early 1960s, the Nigerian-Rhodesian connection, I don't think has really been talked about at all. And what was very interesting for me, it was going into the National Archives of Zimbabwe. And so at this time, another sort of complicating factor, but I think is very important to the international dimension, is Southern Rhodesia was part of something called the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland.
Yes.
So it was actually formally through legal governance structures linked with what is today's Malawi and Zambia. But I more or less don't really treat them as being that distinct.
Okay.
The white settler element really controlled this federation. And this federation was represented in Nigeria for 3 years, from 1960 to 1963. And of course, this was one of the greatest triumphs of the region's white settlers in sort of their Pan-African diplomacy. And so this was a source of much angst for their anti-colonial nationalist opponents. And Nigeria was not, totally, wasn't like a sort of Banda and Malawi situation where they were very pro-settler. The Zimbabwean nationalists were able to travel to Nigeria at this time. They were getting major financial support. And so I tried to delve into this complicated and somewhat contradictory relationship in some detail. I can't do but so much in terms of tying it into broader Pan-African politics, the competing Monrovia and Casablanca blocks, and these different views on African development. But I think that will come out a little bit, and certainly to readers who have that background and knowledge, I hope they can appreciate my in-depth dive on Nigeria's role in colonial Zimbabwe. And I think it really, to sort of answer the crux of your question, it is probably the best example of something I try to draw out in this book. A lot of the histories will look at one racial group and sort of predominantly focus on one to the exclusion of the other. I try to address them fairly equally. And given that Nigeria had these formal diplomatic relations with the Federation, but also welcoming the nationalist opponents, I think it's really a great country to draw out the complexity of the political diplomatic conflict unfolding at the time.
Wonderful. So now the differences between African nationalists that led to the split in the nationalist movements leading to the formation of ZAPU, ZANU, Florizi, all these other political parties that fought independently and separately. How was it, impacted? Was it reflected in the relations between Southern Rhodesia and these other countries? Is it something that you saw in your research that, the role that these countries decolonization had or their independence had on Southern Rhodesia was also impacted by those kinds of differences within the nationalist movement?
So this first part of the book that focuses on sort of the domestic events, I have a chapter that is pretty much entirely focused on splits in the nationalist movement. So that really starts in, actually, most people think about 1963 with the emergence of the Zimbabwe African National Union, but something I tried to really bring out is, well, there was another major split 2 years earlier in 1961 when a group called the Zimbabwe National Party broke away from what was then the main nationalist group, the National Democratic Party. And so I position both this 1961 and the 1963 split as being very much shaped by what happened elsewhere in Africa. So if you look at the 1961, the sort of original neglected split, but there were major figures involved with it. I talked quite a bit about Paul Mashonga, who had been sort of the number 3 figure in the City Youth League in the 1950s. Michael Mwema, who had actually been the president of the NDP, was also on the executive of this party. And these were people who traveled quite a bit globally, on the continent, had major connections. And you can see in their manifesto, in their founding launch, they're appealing to examples of other African countries, looking at Zambia, looking at Ghana, where you had breakaway parties that had eclipsed the original. This party attended Pan-African conferences in Ghana, got financial support from Kwame Nkrumah. It's got very strong backing from Kamuzu Banda in Malawi. And this was something, again, that played out a few years later when ZANU was formed in 1963. And even on a sort of much wider scale, the new party sent emissaries sort of all over the continent, boasted of the support that it had, attacked what was now ZAPU, that it had broken away from for having very limited Pan-African support, really pointing to Egypt as the main backer of Nkomo on the continent. And so, yeah, I mean, there are certainly domestic issues at play, but I think the Pan-African diplomacy at work was quite important as well. And certainly ZANU emerged just a few months after the founding summit of the OAU, where people like Nkomo and Mugabe and Sithole had been at odds. So yeah, these splits, I think there was very much an international dimension connected to African decolonization. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, gotcha.
Oh, nice. I'm so sorry for that. So now I want you to take me through the historiography of the discourse that you contribute to. What would you say is your major contribution, to the discourse itself of African nationalism, of Pan-Africanism, of just the decolonization movement in general?
I mean, starting with in Zimbabwe, I would say the work that impacted me the most was probably Tim Scarnecchia's first book, the roots of I think urban violence and democracy in Zimbabwe. And that was a work that I think in the last 20 years, really, as Zimbabwe's political situation has deteriorated, there's been an effort to sort of get beyond the patriotic histories of the 1980s, these histories that were very celebratory about the nationalist movement, very uncritical, and that accepted the narratives promulgated by the current Zimbabwean government. And I think this book is certainly a continuation of the efforts to push back against that, while injecting this international dimension. I think in terms of the broader sort of positioning of the book, I'm very much influenced by what I think is still a very sort of emerging body of literature or argument that perhaps seeks to treat political independence and this period of sort of decolonization in the 50s and 60s sort of as a field of study in its own right. Thinking of some work, especially that's been done on the DR Congo in the early 1960s and its reverberations within Southern Africa. I think so much of the literature really has focused on positioning decolonization as sort of a response to the Cold War or a strategic calculations made by the imperial powers. But certainly, I think at least in Southern Africa, where the independence process was a bit delayed and more prolonged, there was the wind of change. There were developments on the continent that were drawing a lot of attention. And I think the scholarship perhaps has traditionally downplayed or minimized how individuals, political elites in the region, in Southern Africa, were shaped by those developments and perhaps tried a bit too much to interpret that through sort of Eurocentric or great power competition. So yeah, the book is very much sort of colonial Zimbabwe as a case study, really getting down, digging deep, looking at sort of niche issues, but in terms of positioning it more broadly, I really want to encourage scholars, students, readers, historical enthusiasts to sort of think of this period of decolonization in the 50s and 60s as something that might be a terrain of study in its own right, much like Cold War studies is viewed as being. There's a lot of interesting case studies. So I would say if you're not necessarily as enthusiastic about Zimbabwean history as I am, but other issues, I think there's something that will speak to you. So the chapter on the DR Congo, I look at the death of the UN Secretary General, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. So there are sort of a number of other major events within Africa in the 50s and the 60s that this book explores from the Zimbabwean perspective. But I think it will give scholars and students interested, and primarily with primary interest in these other countries, a new dimension to understanding what happened as well.
That is great. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Brooks. I am very much happy to have had you here. Viewers and listeners, don't forget to click the link that is in the description panel on the upload for this video to get a copy of Dr. Brooks' book, Pan-Africanism and Partnership. It can be accessed right there. You can buy a copy. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.